I was promised a wig. Hey. The glare's a little much, though, don't you think? Oof. Wow, these really help, though. Actually. Really. Hi, AJ. Can't see my eyes. Let me just... They actually work, yeah. I'm going to put on flux or night mode. 1 second. There we go. Hey, Thumpers. It was okay. Doing all right. Okay. You're fine, Aster. Okay. All right. So today we have... Hi, Stephen. We have... What are my eyebrows doing today? Today we have a special. No, they're just blue light glasses. We have a special Harry Potter book club. I have my makeup bag. After we read today, we are going to do his mannequin head's makeup. I don't know how to do makeup, so it's going to be something. It's going to be something else. Hold on. I feel like... I'm just trying to get the exposure right because it's a little freaking bright in here. Okay. We're going to get weird with it. It's Bustina. Okay, y'all. Are we ready? Apparently. This is some good chapters that we're about to read. It's not dark. It's fine. Philip. Some good chapters coming up here. We are on... Yes. Hi, Dima. Bye, Dima. Love you too, dude. Chapter 8 and Chapter 9 is what we will be reading. Looks like Chapter 8 is a long one. Big old long one. A whole 20 pages. And Chapter 9... We are reading 50 pages today, guys. All right. We'll be reading a big chunk of it. Let's get started, shall we? The Quidditch World Cup. Clutching their purchases, Mr. Weasley in the lead, they all hurried into the wood, following the lantern-lit trail. They could hear the sounds of thousands of people moving around them, shouts and laughter, snatches of singing. The atmosphere of feverish excitement was highly infectious. Harry couldn't stop grinning. They walked through the wood for 20 minutes, talking and joking loudly, until at last they emerged on the other side, and found themselves in the shadow of a gigantic stadium. Though Harry could see only a fraction of the immense gold walls surrounding the field, he could tell that 10 cathedrals would fit comfortably inside it. "Seats 100,000, said Mr. Weasley, spotting the awestruck look on Harry's face. "Ministry task force of 500 have been working on it all year, Muggle-repelling charms on every inch of it. Every time Muggles have got anywhere near here all year, they've suddenly remembered urgent appointments and had to dash away again. Bless them." Leading the way toward the nearest entrance, which was already surrounded by a swarm of shouting witches and wizards. "Prime seats," said the Ministry. said the ministry witch at the entrance when she checked their tickets. Top box. Straight upstairs, Arthur, and as high as you can go. The stairs into the stadium were carpeted in rich purple. They clambered upward with the rest of the crowd, which slowly filtered away through the doors into the stands to their left and right. Mr. Weasley's party kept climbing, and at last they reached the top of the staircase and found themselves in a small box, set at the highest point of the stadium and situated exactly halfway between the golden goalposts. About 20 purple and gilt chairs stood in 2 rows here, and Harry, filing into the front seats with the Weasleys, looked down upon a scene the likes of which he could never have imagined. 100,000 witches and wizards were taking their places in the seats, which rose in levels around the long oval field. Everything was suffused with a mysterious golden light, which seemed to come from the stadium itself. The field looked smooth as velvet from their lofty position. At either end of the field stood 3 gold hoops, 50 feet high. Right opposite them, almost at Harry's eye level, was a gigantic blackboard. Gold writing kept dashing across it as though an invisible giant's hand were scrawling upon the blackboard and then wiping it off again. Watching it, Harry saw that it was flashing advertisements across the field. The Blue Bottle, a broom for all the family. Safe, reliable, and with built-in anti-burglar buzzer. Mrs. Scour's all-purpose magical mess remover. No pain, no stain. Glad rags, wizardwear. London, Paris, Hogsmeade. Harry tore his eyes away from the sign and looked over his shoulder to see who else was sharing the box with them. So far it was empty, except for a tiny creature sitting in the second from last seat at the end of the row behind them. The creature, whose legs were so short they stuck out in front of it on the chair, was wearing a tea towel draped like a toga, and it had its face hidden in its hands. Yet those long, bat-like ears were oddly familiar. "Toffee?" said Harry incredulously. The tiny creature looked up and stretched its fingers, revealing enormous brown eyes and a nose the exact size and shape of a large tomato. It wasn't Dobby. It was, however, unmistakably a house elf, as Harry's friend Dobby had been. Harry had set Dobby free from his old owners, the Malfoy family. "Did Sir just call me Dobby?" squeaked the elf curiously from between its fingers. Its voice was higher even than Dobby's had been, a teeny, quivering squeak of a voice, and Harry suspected, though it was very hard to tell with a house elf, that this one might just be female. Ron and Hermione spun around in their seats to look. Though they had heard a lot about Dobby from Harry, they had never actually seen him. Even Mr. Weasley looked around in interest. "Sorry," Harry told the elf. "I just thought you were someone I knew." "But I knows Dobby too, sir," squeaked the elf. She was shielding her face, as though blinded by light, though the top box was not brightly lit. "My name is Winky, sir. And you, sir—" Her dark brown eyes widened to the size of the side plates as they rested upon Harry's scar. "You is surely Harry Potter." "Yeah, I am," said Harry. "But Dobby talks of you all the time, sir," she said, lowering her hands very slightly and looking awestruck. "How is he? How's freedom suiting him?" "Ah, sir," said Winky, shaking her head. "Ah, sir, meaning no disrespect, sir, but I is not sure you did Dobby a favor, sir, when you is setting him free." "Why?" said Harry, taken aback. "What's wrong with him?" "Freedom is going to Dobby's head, sir," said Winky sadly. "Ideas above his station, sir. Can't get another position, sir." "Why not?" said Harry. Winky lowered her voice by a half octave and whispered, "He is wanting paying for his work, sir." "Paying?" said Harry blankly. "Well, why shouldn't he be paid?" Winky looked quite horrified at the idea and closed her fingers slightly so that her face was half hidden again. "House elves is not paid, sir," she said in a muffled squeak. No. I says to Dobby, I says, go find yourself a nice family and settle down, Dobby. He's getting up to all sorts of hijinks, sir, what is unbecoming to a house elf. You goes racketing around like this, Dobby, I says, and the next thing I hears you is up in front of the Department of Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures, like some common goblin. "Well, it's about time he had a bit of fun," said Harry. "House elves is not supposed to have fun, Harry Potter," said Winky firmly, from behind her hands. "House elves does what they is told. I is not liking heights at all, Harry Potter." She glanced toward the edge of the box and gulped. "But my master sends me to the top box, and I comes, sir." Why has he sent you up here, if he knows you don't like heights? Said Harry, frowning. Master wants me to save him a seat, Harry Potter. He is very busy, said Winky, tilting her head toward the empty space beside her. Winky is wishing she is back in Master's tent, Harry Potter, but Winky does what she is told. Winky is a good house elf. She gave the edge of the box another frightened look and hid her eyes completely again. Harry turned back to the others. So that's a house elf, Ron muttered. Weird things, aren't they? Dobby was weirder, said Harry fervently. Ron pulled out his omnioculars, and started testing them, staring down into the crowd on the other side of the stadium. Wild, he said, twiddling the replay knob on the side. I can make that old bloke down there pick his nose again, and again, and again. Hermione, meanwhile, was skimming eagerly through her velvet-covered, tasseled program. A display from the team mascots will precede the match, she read aloud. Oh, that's always worth watching, said Mr. Weasley. National teams bring creatures from their native land, you know, to put on a bit of a show. The box filled gradually around them over the next half hour. Mr. Weasley kept shaking hands with people who were obviously very important wizards. Percy jumped to his feet so often that he looked as though he were trying to sit on a hedgehog. When Cornelius Fudge, the Minister of Magic himself, arrived, Percy bowed so low that his glasses fell off and shattered. Highly embarrassed, he repaired them with his wand and thereafter remained in his seat, throwing jealous looks at Harry, whom Cornelius Fudge had greeted like an old friend. They had met before, and Fudge shook Harry's hand in a fatherly fashion, asked how he was, and introduced him to the wizards on either side of him. Harry Potter, you know, he told the Bulgarian minister loudly, who was wearing splendid robes of black velvet trimmed with gold and didn't seem to understand a word of English. Harry Potter. Oh, come on now, you know who he is. The boy who survived. You do know who he is. The Bulgarian wizard suddenly spotted Harry's scar and started gabbling loudly and excitedly, pointing at it. Knew he'd get there in the end, said Fudge, warily to Harry. I'm no great shakes at languages. I need Barty Crouch for this sort of thing. I see his house elf saving him a seat. Good job, too. These Bulgarian blighters have been trying to cadge all the best places. Here's Lucius. Harry, Ron, and Hermione turned quickly. Edging along the second row to 3 still empty seats right behind Mr. Weasley were none other than Dobby the house elf's former owners, Lucius Malfoy, his son, Draco, and a woman Harry supposed must be Draco's mother. Harry and Draco Malfoy had been enemies ever since their very first journey to Hogwarts. A pale boy with a pointed face and white blonde hair, Draco greatly resembled his father. His mother was blonde too, tall and slim. She would have been nice-looking if she hadn't been wearing a look that suggested there was a nasty smell under her nose. Ah, Fudge, said Mr. Malfoy, holding out his hand as he reached the Minister of Magic. How are you? I don't think you've met my wife, Narcissa, or our son, Draco. How do you do, said Fudge, smiling and bowing to Mrs. Malfoy. And allow me to introduce you to Mr. Oblongsk. Oblongsk? Well, he's the Bulgarian Minister of Magic, and he can't understand a word I'm saying anyway, so never mind. And let's see who else. You know Arthur Weasley, I dare say. It was a tense moment. Mr. Weasley. Hi, Chris. I know, you're not wrong. You're not wrong, Tony. Sorry. Narcissist. It was a tense moment. Mr. Weasley and Mr. Malfoy looked at each other, and Harry vividly recalled the last time they had come face to face. It had been in Flourish and Blott's bookshop, and they had had a fight. Mr. Malfoy's cold, grey eyes swept over Mr. Weasley, and then up and down the row. Good Lord, Arthur, he said softly. What did you have to sell to get seats in the top box? Surely your house wouldn't have fetched this much. Fudge, who wasn't listening, said, Lucius has given a very generous contribution to St. Mungo's Hospital for magical maladies and injuries. I was going to say maladies, because it had a hyphen in the middle of the word. Magical maladies and injuries, Arthur. He's here as my guest. How nice, said Mr. Weasley with a very strange smile. Mr. Malfoy's eyes had returned to Hermione, who went slightly pink but stared determinedly back at him. Harry knew exactly what was making Mr. Malfoy's lip curl like that. The Malfoys, Millard, prided themselves on being purebloods. In other words, they considered anyone of Muggle descent, like Hermione, second class. However, under the gaze of the Minister of Magic, Mr. Malfoy didn't dare say anything. He nodded sneeringly to Mr. Weasley and continued down the line to his seats. Draco shot Harry, Ron, and Hermione one contemptuous look, then settled himself between his mother and father. "Slimy gits," Ron muttered as he, Harry, and Hermione turned to face the field again. Next moment, Ludo Bagman charged into the box. "Everyone ready?" he said, his round face gleaming like a great excited Edam. Edam? I don't know. "Minister, ready to go?" "Ready when you are, Ludo," said Fudge comfortably. Ludo whipped out his wand, directed it at his own throat, and said, "Sonorous," and then spoke over the roar of sound that was now filling the packed stadium. His voice echoed over them, booming into every corner of the stands. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Welcome to the final of the 422nd Quidditch World Cup." The spectators screamed and clapped. Thousands of flags waved, adding their discordant national anthems to the racket. The huge blackboard opposite them was wiped clear of its last message: "Birdies, bots, every flavor beans. A risk with every mouthful." And now showed Bulgaria 0, Ireland 0. And now, without further ado, allow me to introduce the Bulgarian national team mascots. The right-hand side of the stands, which was a solid block of scarlet, roared its approval. "I wonder what they've brought," said Mr. Weasley, leaning forward in his seat. "Ah," he suddenly whipped off his glasses and polished them hurriedly on his robes. "Vila! What are Vila?" But 100 Vila were now gliding out onto the field, and Harry's question was answered for him. Vila were women, the most beautiful women Harry had ever seen, except that they couldn't be human. This puzzled Harry for a moment while he tried to guess what exactly they could be. What could make their skin shine moon bright like that, or their white golden hair fan out behind them without wind? But then the music started, and Harry stopped worrying about them not being human. In fact, he stopped worrying about anything at all. The Vila had started to dance, and Harry's mind had gone completely and blissfully blank. All that mattered in the world was that he kept watching the Vila, because if they stopped dancing, terrible things would happen. And as the Vila danced faster and faster, wild, half-formed thoughts started chasing through Harry's dazed mind. He wanted to do something very impressive right now. Jumping from the box into the stadium seemed a good idea, but would it be good enough? "Harry, what are you doing?" said Hermione's voice from a long way off. The music stopped. Harry blinked. He was standing up, and one of his legs was resting on the wall of the box. Next to him, Ron was frozen in an attitude that looked as though he were about to dive from a springboard. Angry yells were filling the stadium. The crowd didn't want the Vila to go. Harry was with them. He would, of course, be supporting Bulgaria, and he wondered vaguely why he had a large green shamrock pinned to his chest. Ron, meanwhile, was absent-mindedly shredding the shamrocks on his hat. Mr. Weasley, smiling slightly, leaned over to Ron and tugged the hat out of his hands. "You'll be wanting that," he said, "once Ireland have had their say." "Huh?" said Ron, staring open-mouthed at the Vila, who had now lined up along one side of the field. Hermione made a loud tutting noise. She reached up and pulled Harry back into his seat. "Honestly," she said. "Hi, John." "And now," roared Ludo Bagman's voice, "kindly put your wands in the air for the Irish national team mascots." Next moment, what seemed to be a great green and gold comet came zooming into the stadium. It did one circuit of the stadium, then split into two smaller comets, each hurtling toward the goalposts. A rainbow arced suddenly across the field, connecting the two balls of light. The crowd oohed and awed, as though at a fireworks display. Now the rainbow faded and the balls of light reunited and merged. They had formed a great shimmering shamrock, which rose up into the sky and began to soar over the stand, something like golden. I need to take my allergy medicine. I'm sorry. They had formed a great shimmering shamrock, which rose up into the sky and began to soar over the stands. Something like golden rain seemed to be falling from it. Excellent, yelled Ron as the shamrock soared over them, and heavy gold coins rained from it, bouncing off their heads and seats. Squinting up at the shamrock, Harry realized that it was actually comprised of thousands of tiny little bearded men with red vests, each carrying a minute lamp of gold or green. She really likes the word minute. Really does. Leprechauns, said Mr. Weasley over the tumultuous applause of the crowd, many of whom were still fighting and rummaging around under their chairs to retrieve the gold. There you go, Ron yelled happily, stuffing a fistful of gold coins into Harry's hand. For the omnioculars. Now you've got to buy me a Christmas present. Ha! The great shamrock dissolved. The leprechauns drifted down onto the field, onto the opposite side of the villa, and settled themselves cross-legged to watch the match. And now, ladies and gentlemen, kindly welcome the Bulgarian national Quidditch team. I give you Dimitrov, a scarlet-clad figure on a broomstick, moving so fast it was blurred, shot out onto the field from an entrance far below, to wild applause from the Bulgarian supporters. Ivanova, a second scarlet-robed player, zoomed out. Zograf, Levski, Volkanov, Volkov, and Crumb. That's him! That's him! Yelled Ron, following Clum with his omnioculars. Harry quickly focused his own. Victor Crumb was thin, dark, and sallow-skinned, with a large curved nose and thick black eyebrows. He looked like an overgrown bird of prey. It was hard to believe he was only 18. And now, please greet the Irish national Quidditch team, yelled the Bagman, presenting Connolly, Ryan, Troy, Mullet, Moran, Quigley, and Lynch. 7 green blurs swept onto the field. Harry spun a small dial on the side of his omnioculars and slowed the players down enough to read the word Firebolt on each of their brooms and see their names embroidered in silver upon their backs. And here, all the way from Egypt, our referee, acclaimed chair wizard of the International Association of Quidditch, Hassan Mustafa, a small and skinny wizard, completely bald but with a mustache to rival Uncle Vernon's, wearing robes of pure gold to match the stadium, strode out onto the field. A silver whistle was protruding from under the mustache, and he was carrying a large wooden crate under one arm, his broomstick under the other. Harry spun the speed dial on his omnioculars back to normal, watching closely as Mustafa mounted his broomstick and kicked the crate open. 4 balls burst into the air. The scarlet quaffle, the 2 black bludgers, and, Harry saw it for the briefest moment before it sped out of sight, the minuscule, well, not the minute, winged golden snitch. Hi, Isaac. With a sharp blast on his whistle, Mustafa shot into the air after the balls. They're off, screamed Bagman. And it's Mullet, Troy, Moran, and Dimitrov. Back to Mullet, Troy, Levski, Moran. It was Quidditch as Harry had never seen it played before. He was pressing his omnioculars so hard to his glasses that they were cutting into the bridges of his nose. The speed of the players was incredible. The chasers were throwing the quaffle to one another so fast that Bagman only had time to say their names. Harry spun the slow dial on the right of his omnioculars again, pressed the play-by-play button on the top, and he was immediately watching in slow motion, while glittering purple lettering flashed across the lenses and the noise of the crowd pounded against his eardrums. Hawkshead attacking formation, he read as he watched the 3 Irish chasers zoom closely together. Troy in the center, slightly ahead of Mullet and Moran, bearing down upon the Bulgarians. Porskov ploy flashed up next, as Troy made as though to dart upward with the quaffle, drawing away the Bulgarian chaser, Anova, and dropping the quaffle to Moran. One of the Bulgarian beaters, Volkov, swung hard at a passing bludger with his small club, knocking into Moran's path. Moran ducked to avoid the bludger and dropped the quaffle, and Levski, soaring beneath, caught it. Troy scores, roared Bagman, and the stadium shuddered with a roar of applause and cheers. 10-0 to Ireland. What? Harry yelled, looking wildly around through his omnioculars. But Levski's got the quaffle. Harry, if you're not going to watch at normal speed, you're going to miss things, shouted Hermione, who was dancing up and down, waving her arms in the air while Troy did a lap of honor around the field. Harry looked quickly over the top of his omnioculars and saw that the leprechauns watching from the sidelines had all risen into the air again and formed the great glittering shamrock. Across the field, the villa were watching them sulkily. Furious with himself, Harry spun his speed dial back to normal as the play resumed. Harry knew enough about Quidditch to see that the Irish chasers were superb. They worked as a seamless team, their movements so well coordinated that they appeared to be reading one another's minds as they positioned themselves, and the rosette on Harry's chest kept squeaking their names, Troy, Mullet, Moran, and within 10 minutes Ireland had scored twice more, bringing their lead to 30-0, and causing a thunderous tide of roars and applause from the green-clad supporters. What's up, Kaylin? Asked her, please. The match became still faster, but more brutal. Volkov and Volkanov, the Bulgarian beaters, were whacking the bludgers as fiercely as possible at the Irish chasers, and were starting to prevent them from using some of their best moves. Twice they were forced to scatter, and then, finally, Ivanova managed to break through their ranks, dodge the keeper, Ryan, and score Bulgaria's first goal. "Fingers in your ears," bellowed Mr. Weasley as the Vila started to dance in celebration. Harry screwed up his eyes, too. He wanted to keep his mind on the game. After a few seconds, he chanced to glance at the field. The Vila had stopped dancing, and Bulgaria was again in possession of the quaffle. "Dimitrov, Levski, Dimitrov, Ivanova, oh, I say," roared Bagman. 100,000 wizards gasped as the two seekers, Crumb and Lynch, plummeted through the center of the chasers, so fast that it looked as though they had just jumped from the airplanes without parachutes. Harry followed their descent through his omnioculars, squinting to see where the snitch was. "They're going to crash," screamed Hermione next to Harry. She was half right. At the very last second, Victor Crumb pulled out of the dive and spiraled off. Lynch, however, hit the ground with a dull thud that could be heard throughout the stadium. A huge groan rose from the Irish seats. "Fool," moaned Mr. Weasley. "Crumb was fainting." "It's time out," yelled Bagman's voice, as trained Medi-Wizards hurry onto the field to examine Aiden Lynch. "He'll be okay. He only got plowed. Please don't make fun of me," Charlie said reassuringly to Ginny, who was hanging over the side of the box, looking horror-struck. Which is what Crumb was after, of course. Harry hastily pressed the replay and play-by-play buttons on his omnioculars, twiddled the speed dial, and put them back up to his eyes. He watched as Crumb and Lynch dived, again in slow motion. Wronski, defensive feint. Dangerous seeker diversion. Read the shining purple lettering across his lenses. He saw Crumb's face contorted with concentration as he pulled out of the dive just in time, while Lynch was flattened. And he understood. Crumb hadn't seen a snitch at all. He was just making Lynch copy him. Harry had never seen anyone fly like that. Crumb hardly looked as though he was using a broomstick at all. He moved so easily through the air that he looked unsupported and weightless. Harry turned his omnioculars back to normal and focused them on Crumb. He was now circling high above Lynch, who was being revived by Medi-Wizards with cups of potion. Harry, focusing still more closely upon Crumb's face, saw his dark eyes darting all over the ground 100 feet below. He was using the time while Lynch was revived to look for the snitch without interference. Lynch got to his feet at last, to loud cheers from the green-clad supporters, mounted his firebolt, and kicked back off into the air. His revival seemed to give Ireland new heart. When Mustafa blew his whistle again, the chasers moved into action with this skill, unrivaled by anything Harry had seen so far. After 15 more fast and furious minutes, Ireland had pulled ahead by 10 more goals. They were now leading by 130 points to 10, and the game was starting to get dirtier. As Mullet shot toward the goalposts yet again, clutching the quaffle tightly under her arm, the Bulgarian keeper, Zograf, flew out to meet her. Whatever happened was over so quickly Harry didn't catch it, but a scream of rage from the Irish crowd, and Mustafa's long, shrill whistle blast told him it had been foul. And Mustafa takes the Bulgarian keeper to task for cobbing excessive use of elbows, Bagman informed the roaring spectators, and, yes, it's a penalty to Ireland. The leprechauns, who had risen angrily into the air like a swarm of glittering hornets when Mullet had been fouled, now darted together to form the words, "Ha, ha, ha." The Vila on the other side of the field leapt to their feet, tossed their hair angrily, and started to dance again. As one, the Weasley boys and Harry stuffed their fingers into their ears, but Hermione, who hadn't bothered, was soon tugging on Harry's arm. He turned to look at her, and she pulled his fingers impatiently out of his ears. "Look at the referee," she said, giggling. Harry looked down at the field. Hassan Mustafa had landed right in front of the dancing Vila and was acting very oddly indeed. He was flexing his muscles and smoothing his mustache excitedly. "Now we can't have that," said Ludo Bagman, though he sounded highly amused. Somebody slapped the referee. A Mediwizard came tearing across the field, his fingers stuffed into his own ears, and kicked Mustafa hard in the shins. Mustafa seemed to come to himself. Harry, watching through the omnioculars again, saw that he looked exceptionally embarrassed, and he had started shouting at the Vila, who had stopped dancing and were looking mutinous. "And unless I'm mistaken, Mustafa is actually attempting to send off the Bulgarian team mascots," said Bagman's voice. "Now there's something we haven't seen before. Oh, this could turn nasty." It did. The Bulgarian beaters, Volkov and Volkanov, landed on either side of Mustafa and began arguing furiously with him, gesticulating toward the leprechauns, who had now gleefully formed the words, "he, he, he." Mustafa was not impressed by the Bulgarians' arguments, however. He was jabbing his fingers into the air, clearly telling them to get flying again, and when they refused, he gave 2 short blasts on his whistle. 2 penalties for Ireland," shouted Bagman, and the Bulgarian crowd howled with anger. And Volkov and Volkanov had better get back on those brooms. Yes, there they go, and Troy takes the quaffle. Play now reached a level of ferocity beyond anything they had yet seen. The beaters on both sides were acting without mercy. Volkov and Volkanov in particular seemed not to care whether their clubs made contact with bludger or human as they swung them violently through the air. Dimitrov shot straight at Moran, who had the quaffle, nearly knocking her off her broom. "Foul!" roared the Irish supporters as one, all standing up in a great wave of green. "Foul!" echoed Ludo Bagman's magically magnified voice. Dimitrov skins Moran, deliberately flying to collide there, and it's got to be another penalty. Yep, there's the whistle. The leprechauns had risen into the air again, and this time they formed a giant hand, which was making a very rude sign indeed at the Vila across the field. At this, the Vila lost control. Instead of dancing, they launched themselves across the field and began throwing what seemed to be handfuls of fire at the leprechauns. Watching through his omnioculars, Harry saw that they didn't look remotely beautiful now. On the contrary, their faces were elongating into sharp, cruel-beaked bird heads, and long, scaly wings were bursting from their shoulders. "And that, boys," yelled Mr. Weasley over the tumult of the crowd below, "is why you should never go for looks alone." Ministry wizards were flooding onto the field to separate the Vila and the leprechauns, but with little success. Meanwhile, the pitched battle below was nothing to the one taking place above. Harry turned this way and that, staring through the omnioculars as the quaffle changed hands with the speed of a bullet. Levski, Dimitrov, Morin, Troy, Mullet, Ivanova, Morin again, Morin scores. But the cheers of the Irish supporters were barely heard over the shrieks of the Vila, the blasts now issuing from the ministry members' wands, and the furious roars of the Bulgarians. The game recommenced immediately. Now Levski had the quaffle, now Dimitrov. I'm pretty sure I'm pronouncing all of these names differently each time. I was going to end the chapter. The Irish beater Quigley swung heavily at a passing bludger and hit it as hard as possible toward Crumb, who did not duck quickly enough. It hit him full in the face. There was a deafening groan from the crowd. Crumb's nose looked broken. There was blood everywhere, but Hassan Mustafa didn't blow his whistle. He had become distracted, and Harry couldn't blame him. One of the Vila had thrown a handful of fire and set his broomtail alight. Harry wanted someone to realize that Crumb was injured, even though he was supporting Ireland. Crumb was the most exciting player on the field. Ron obviously felt the same. "Time out! Aw, come on, he can't play like that. Look at him. Look at Lynch," Harry yelled. For the Irish seeker had suddenly gone into a dive, and Harry was quite sure that this was no Wronski feint. This was the real thing. "He's seen the snitch," Harry shouted. "He's seen it. Look at him go." Half the crowd seemed to have realized what was happening. The Irish supporters rose in another great wave of green, screaming their seeker on, but Crumb was on his tail. How could he see where he was going? Harry had no idea. There were flecks of blood flying through the air behind him, but he was drawing level with Lynch now as the pair of them hurtled toward the ground again. "They're going to crash!" shrieked Hermione. "They're not!" roared Ron. "Lynch is!" yelled Harry. And he was right. For the second time, Lynch hit the ground with tremendous force and was immediately stampeded by a horde of angry Vila. "The snitch! Where's the snitch?" bellowed Charlie along the row. "He's got it! Crumb's got it! It's all over!" shouted Harry. Crumb, his red robes shining with blood from his nose, was rising gently into the air, his fist held high, a glint of gold in his hand. The scoreboard was flashing: Bulgaria 160, Ireland 170. Across the crowd, who didn't seem to have realized what had happened. Then, slowly, as though a great jumbo jet were revving up, the rumbling from the Ireland supporters grew louder and louder and erupted into screams of delight. So Crumb is the best, but he's not smart enough to recognize that he shouldn't have caught it right then. He should have just swatted it so Lynch didn't get it. "Ireland wins," Bagman shouted, who, like the Irish, seemed to be taken aback by the sudden end of the match. "Crumb gets the snitch, but Ireland wins. Good Lord, I don't think any of us were expecting that." Except for Fred and George. "What did he catch the snitch for?" Ron bellowed, even as he jumped up and down, applauding with his hands over his head. "He ended it when Ireland were 160 points ahead, the idiot." "He knew they were never going to catch up," Harry shouted back over all the noise, also applauding loudly. "The Irish chasers were too good. He wanted to end it on his terms, that's all." "He was very brave, wasn't he?" Hermione said, leaning forward to watch Crumb land as a swarm of Mediwizards blasted a path through the battling leprechauns and Vila to get to him. "He looks a terrible mess." No, they just get 150 points, which is usually like an automatic win. Harry put his omnioculars to his eyes again. It was hard to see what was happening below, because leprechauns were zooming delightedly all over the field, but he could just make out Crumb, surrounded by Mediwizards. He looked surlier than ever and refused to let them mop him up. His team members were around him, shaking their heads and looking dejected. A short way away, the Irish players were dancing gleefully in a shower of gold descending from their mascots. Flags were waving all over the stadium. The Irish national anthem blared from all sides. The Vila were shrinking back into their usual beautiful selves now, though looking dispirited and forlorn. "Well, we fought bravely," said a gloomy voice behind Harry. He looked around. It was the Bulgarian Minister of Magic. "You can speak English," said Fudge, sounding outraged, "and you've been letting me mime everything all day." "Well, it was very funny," said the Bulgarian Minister, shrugging. And as the Irish team performs a lap of honor, flanked by their mascots, the Quidditch World Cup itself is brought into the top box, roared Bagman. Harry's eyes were suddenly dazzled by a blinding white light, as the top box was magically illuminated so that everyone in the stands could see the inside. Squinting toward the entrance, he saw two panting wizards carrying a vast golden cup into the box, which they handed to Cornelius Fudge, who was still looking very disgruntled that he'd been using sign language all day for nothing. "Let's have a really loud hand for the gallant losers, Bulgaria," Bagman shouted. And up the stairs into the box came the 7 defeated Bulgarian players. The crowd below was applauding appreciatively. Harry could see thousands and thousands of omniocular lenses flashing and winking in their direction. One by one, the Bulgarians filed between the rows of seats in the box, and Bagman called out the name of each as they shook hands with their own minister, and then with Fudge. Crumb, who was last in line, looked a real mess. 2 black eyes were blooming spectacularly on his bloody face. He was still holding the snitch. Harry noticed that he seemed much less coordinated on the ground. He was slightly duck-footed and distinctly round-shouldered, but when Crumb's name was announced, the whole stadium gave him a resounding, ear-splitting roar. And then came the Irish team. Aidan Lynch was being supported by Moran and Connolly. The second crash seemed to have dazed him, and his eyes looked strangely unfocused. But he grinned happily as Troy and Quigley lifted the cup into the air, and the crowd below thundered its approval. Harry's hands were numb with clapping. At last, when the Irish team had left the box to perform another lap of honor on their brooms, Aidan Lynch on the back of Connolly's, clutching hard around his waist and still grinning in a bemused sort of way, Bagman pointed his wand at his throat and muttered, quietus. "They'll be talking about this one for years," he said hoarsely. "A really unexpected twist that... Shame, it couldn't have lasted longer. Ah, yes, I owe you. How much?" For Fred and George had just scrambled over the backs of their seats and were standing in front of Ludo Bagman with broad grins on their faces, their hands outstretched. So that was for all those people that waited 2 weeks, had like bad seats and got there 2 weeks early, just for the game to end in less than an hour. That's pretty great. That is pretty great. Okay. Chapter 9. "Don't tell your mother you've been gambling," Mr. Weasley implored Fred and George as they all made their way slowly down the purple carpeted stairs. "Don't worry, Dad," said Fred gleefully. "We've got big plans for this money. We don't want it confiscated." Mr. Weasley looked for a moment as though he was going to ask what these big plans were, but seemed to decide, upon reflection, that he didn't want to know. They were soon caught up in the crowds now flooding out of the stadium and back to their campsites. Ruckus, she likes that word too. Singing was borne toward them on the night air as they retraced their steps along the lantern-lit path, and leprechauns kept shooting over their heads, cackling and waving their lanterns. When they finally reached the tents, nobody felt like sleeping at all, and given the level of noise around them, Mr. Weasley agreed that they could all have one last cup of cocoa together before turning in. They were soon arguing enjoyably about the match. Mr. Weasley got drawn into a disagreement about the cobbing with Charlie, and it was only when Ginny fell asleep right at the tiny table and spilled hot chocolate all over the floor that Mr. Weasley called a halt to the verbal replays and insisted that everyone go to bed. Hermione and Ginny went into the next tent, and Harry and the rest of the Weasleys changed into pajamas and clambered into their bunks. From the other side of the campsite they could still hear much singing and the odd echoing bang. "Oh, I am glad I'm not on duty," muttered Mr. Weasley sleepily. "I wouldn't fancy having to go and tell the Irish they've got to stop celebrating." Harry, who was on a top bunk above Ron, lay staring up at the canvas ceiling of the tent, watching the glow of an occasional leprechaun lantern flying overhead, and picturing again some of Crumb's more spectacular moves. He was itching to get back on his own firebolt and try out the Wronski feint. Somehow Oliver Wood had never managed to convey with all his wriggling diagrams what that move was supposed to look like. Harry saw himself in robes that had his name on the back, and imagined the sensation of hearing 100,000-strong crowd roar as Ludo Bagman's voice echoed throughout the stadium. "I give you Potter." Harry never knew whether or not he had actually dropped off to sleep. His fantasies of flying like Crumb might well have slipped into actual dreams. All he knew was that, quite suddenly, Mr. Weasley was shouting, "Get up! Ron! Harry! Come on now! Get up! This is urgent!" Harry sat up quickly and on top of his head hit canvas. "What's the matter?" he said. Dimly, he could tell that something was wrong. The noises in the campsite had changed. The singing had stopped. He could hear screams, the sound of people running. He slipped down from the bunk and reached for his clothes, but Mr. Weasley, who had pulled on his jeans over his own pajamas, said, "No time, Harry. Just grab a jacket and get outside, quickly." Harry did as he was told and hurried out of the tent, Ron at his heels. By the light of the few fires that were still burning, he could see people running away into the woods, fleeing something that was moving across the field toward them, something that was emitting odd flashes of light and noises like gunfire. Loud jeering, roars of laughter, and drunken yells were drifting toward them. Then came a burst of strong green light, which illuminated the scene. A crowd of wizards, tightly packed and moving together with wands pointing straight upward, was marching slowly across the field. Harry squinted at them. They didn't seem to have faces. Then he realized that their heads were hooded and their faces masked. High above them, floating along in midair, 4 struggling figures were being contorted into grotesque shapes. It was as though the masked wizards on the ground were puppeteers, and the people above them were marionettes, operated by invisible strings that rose from the wands into the air. 2 of the figures were very small. More wizards were joining the marching group, laughing and pointing up at the floating bodies. Tents crumpled and fell as marching crowded swelled. Once or twice Harry saw one of the marchers blast a tent out of his way with his wand. Several caught fire. The screaming grew louder. The floating people were suddenly illuminated as they passed over a burning tent, and Harry recognized one of them. Mr. Roberts, the campsite manager. The other three looked as though they might be his wife and children. One of the marchers below flipped Mrs. Roberts upside down with his wand. Her nightdress fell down to reveal voluminous drawers. And she struggled to cover herself up as the crowd below screeched and hooted with glee. I don't know what's happening right now. That's sick, Ron muttered, watching the smallest Muggle child, who had begun to spin like a top, 60 feet above the ground, his head flopping limply from side to side. That is really sick. Hermione and Ginny came hurrying toward them, pulling coats over their nightdresses, with Mr. Weasley right behind them. At the same moment, Bill, Charlie, and Percy emerged from the boys' tent, fully dressed, with their sleeves rolled up and their wands out. We're going to help the Ministry, Mr. Weasley shouted over all the noise, rolling up his own sleeves. You lot, get into the woods and stick together. I'll come and fetch you when we've sorted this out. Bill, Charlie, and Percy were already sprinting away toward the oncoming marchers. Mr. Weasley tore after them. Ministry wizards were dashing from every direction toward the source of the trouble. The crowd beneath the Roberts family was coming ever closer. Come on, said Fred, grabbing Ginny's hand and starting to pull her toward the wood. That's cute. Harry, Ron, Hermione, and George followed. They all looked back as they reached the trees. The crowd beneath the Roberts family was larger than ever. They could see the Ministry wizards trying to get through it to the hooded wizards in the center, but they were having great difficulty. It looked as though they were scared to perform any spell that might make the Roberts family fall. The colored lanterns that had lit the path to the stadium had been extinguished. Dark figures were blundering through the trees. Children were crying. Anxious shouts and panicked voices were reverberating around them in the cold night air. Harry felt himself being pushed hither and thither. Thither is a word. Hither and thither. By people whose faces he could not see. Then he heard Ron yell with pain. What happened? Said Hermione anxiously, stopping so abruptly that Harry walked into her. Ron, where are you? Oh, this is stupid. Lumos. She illuminated her wand and directed its narrow beam across the path. Ron was lying sprawled on the ground. Tripped over a tree root, he said angrily, getting to his feet again. Well, with feet that size, hard not to do, said a drawling voice behind them. Harry, Ron, and Hermione turned sharply. Draco Malfoy was standing alone nearby, leaning against a tree, looking utterly relaxed. His arms folded, he seemed to have been watching the scene at the campsite through a gap in the trees. Ron told Malfoy to do something that Harry knew he would never have dared say in front of Mrs. Weasley. Language, Weasley, said Malfoy, his pale eyes glittering. Hadn't you better be hurrying along now? You wouldn't like her spotted, would you? Hi, Izzy. He nodded at Hermione, and at the same moment, a blast like a bomb sounded from the campsite, and a flash of green light momentarily lit the trees around them. What's that supposed to mean? Said Hermione defiantly. Granger, they're after muggles, said Malfoy. Do you want to be showing off your knickers in midair? Because if you do, hang around. They're moving this way, and it would give us all a laugh. Hermione's a witch, Harry snarled. Have it your own way, Potter, said Malfoy, grinning maliciously. If you think they can't spot a mudblood, stay where you are. You watch your mouth, shouted Ron. Everybody present knew that mudblood was a very offensive term for a witch or wizard of Muggle parentage. Never mind, Ron, said Hermione quickly, seizing Ron's arm to restrain him as he took a step toward Malfoy. There came a bang from the other side of the trees that was louder than anything they had heard. Several people nearby screamed. Malfoy chuckled softly. Scare easily, don't they? He said lazily. I suppose your daddy told you all to hide. What's he up to? Trying to rescue the muggles? Where's your parents? Said Harry, his temper rising. Out there wearing masks, are they? Malfoy turned his face to Harry, still smiling. Well, if they were, I wouldn't likely to tell you, would I, Potter? Oh, come on, said Hermione, with a disgusted look at Malfoy. Let's go and find the others. Keep that big bushy head down, Granger, sneered Malfoy. Come on, Hermione repeated, and she pulled Harry and Ron up the path again. I'll bet you anything his dad is one of the masked lot, said Ron hotly. Well, with any luck, the Ministry will catch him, said Hermione fervently. Oh, I can't believe this. Where have the others got to? Fred, George, and Ginny were nowhere to be seen, though the path was packed with plenty of other people, all looking nervously over their shoulders toward the commotion back at the campsite. A huddle of teenagers in pajamas was arguing vociferously a little way along the path. When they saw Harry, Ron, and Hermione, a girl with thick curly hair turned and said quickly, "Oui, Madame Maxime. Nous l'avons pour de..." What? Oh. The girl who had spoken turned back on him, and as they walked on, they distinctly heard her say, "Hogwarts." "Beauxbatons," muttered Hermione. "Sorry? They must go to Beauxbatons," said Hermione. "You know, Beauxbatons Academy of Magic. I read about it in an appraisal of magical education in Europe." "Oh, yeah, right. Yeah, you're not wrong, Isaac." Dom, oh my goodness. "Fred and George can't have gone that far," said Ron, pulling out his wand, lighting it like Hermione's and squinting up the path. Harry dug in the pockets of his jacket for his own wand, but it wasn't there. The only thing he could find was his omnioculars. "Oh no, I don't believe it. I've lost my wand." "You're kidding." Ron and Hermione raised their wands high enough to spread the narrow beams of light farther on the ground. Harry looked all around him, but his wand was nowhere to be seen. "Maybe it's back in the tent," said Ron. "Maybe it fell out of your pocket when we were running," Hermione suggested anxiously. "Yeah, maybe." He usually kept his wand with him at all times in the wizarding world, and finding himself without it in the midst of a scene like this made him feel very uncomfortable. A rustling noise nearby made all three of them jump. Winky, the house elf, was fighting her way out of a clump of bushes nearby. She was moving in a most peculiar fashion, apparently with great difficulty. It was as though someone invisible were trying to hold her back. "There's bad wizards about," she squeaked distractedly as she leaned forward and labored to keep running. "People high in the air. Winky is getting out of the way." And she disappeared into the trees on the other side of the path, panting and squeaking as she fought the force that was restraining her. "What's up with her?" said Ron, looking curiously after Winky. "Why can't she run properly?" "Bet she didn't ask permission to hide," said Harry. He was thinking of Dobby. Every time he had tried to do something the Malfoys wouldn't like, the house elf had been forced to start beating himself up. "You know, house elves get a very raw deal," said Hermione indignantly. "It's slavery, that's what it is. That Mr. Crouch made her go up to the top of the stadium, and she was terrified, and he's got her bewitched so she can't even run when they start trampling tents. Why doesn't anyone do something about it?" "Well, the elves are happy, aren't they?" Ron said. "You heard old Winky back at the old match. House elves is not... back at the match. House elves is not supposed to have fun. That's what she likes, being bossed around." "It's people like you, Ron," Hermione began hotly, "who prop up rotten and unjust systems just because they're too lazy to..." Another loud bang echoed from the edge of the wood. "Let's just keep moving, shall we?" said Ron, and Harry saw him glance edgily at Hermione. Perhaps there was truth in what Malfoy had said. Perhaps Hermione was in more danger than they were. They set off again, Harry still searching his pockets, even though he knew his wand wasn't there. They followed the dark path deeper into the wood, still keeping an eye out for Fred, George, and Ginny. They passed a group of goblins who were cackling over a sack of gold that they had undoubtedly won betting on the match, and who seemed quite unperturbed by the trouble at the campsite. Farther still along the path, they walked into a patch of silvery light, and when they looked through the trees, they saw 3 tall and beautiful villas standing in a clearing, surrounded by a gaggle of young wizards, all of whom were talking very loudly. I'll pull down about 100 sacks of galleons a year," one of them shouted. "I'm a dragon killer for the Committee for the Disposal of Dangerous Creatures." "No, you're not," yelled his friend. "You're a dishwasher at the Leaky Cauldron. But I'm a vampire hunter. I've killed about 90 so far." A third young wizard, whose pimples were visible even by the dim, silvery light of the villa, now cut in. "I'm about to become the youngest ever minister of magic, I am." Harry snorted with laughter. He recognized the pimply wizard. His name was Stan Shunpike, and he was in fact a conductor on the triple-decker night bus. He turned to tell Ron this, but Ron's face had gone oddly slack, and next second Ron was yelling, "Did I tell you I've invented a broomstick that'll reach Jupiter?" "Honestly," said Hermione. and she and Harry grappled Ron firmly by the arms and wheeled him around and marched him away. By the time the sounds of the villa and their admirers had faded completely, they were in the very heart of the wood. They seemed to be alone now. I think we're alone now. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. I'm so bad at the accent, Jason. Hi, by the way. I hope you're doing well. Honestly, Harry looked around. I reckon we can just wait here, We'll hear anyone coming a mile off. The words were hardly out of his mouth when Ludo Bagman emerged from behind a tree right ahead of them. Even by the feeble light of 2 wands, Harry could see that a great change had come over Bagman. He no longer looked buoyant and rosy-faced. There was no more spring in his step. He looked very white and strained. "Who's that?" he said, blinking down at them, trying to make out their faces. "What are you doing in here all alone?" They looked at one another, surprised. "Well, there's sort of a riot going on." Bagman stared at him. "What?" "At the campsite. Some people have got hold of a family of muggles." Bagman swore loudly. "Damn them," he said, looking quite distracted, and without another word he disapparated with a small pup. "Not exactly on top of things, Mr. Bagman, is he?" said Hermione. "Sorry, not exactly on top of things, Mr. Bagman, is he?" said Hermione, frowning. "He was a great beater, though," said Ron, leading the way off the path into a small clearing, and sitting down on a patch of dry grass at the foot of the tree. The Wimborne Wasps won the league 3 times in a row while he was with them. He took his small figure of Crumb out of his pocket, set it down on the ground, and watched it walk around. Like the real Crumb, the model was slightly duck-footed and round-shouldered, much less impressive on his splayed feet than on his broomstick. Harry was listening for noise from the campsite. Everything seemed much quieter. Perhaps the riot was over. "I hope the others are okay," said Hermione after a while. "They'll be fine," said Ron. "Imagine if your dad catches Lucius Malfoy," said Harry, sitting down next to Ron and watching the small figure of Crumb slouching over the fallen leaves. "He's always said he'd like to get something on him." "That'd wipe the smirk off old Draco's face, all right," said Ron. "Those poor muggles, though," said Hermione nervously. "What if they can't get them down?" "They will," said Ron reassuringly. "They'll find a way." "Mad, though, to do something like that when the whole Ministry of Magic's out here tonight. I mean, how do they expect to get away with it? Do you think they've been drinking, or are they just—" But she broke off abruptly and looked over her shoulder. Harry and Ron looked quickly around, too. It sounded as though someone was staggering toward their clearing. They waited, listening to the sounds of the uneven steps behind the dark trees, but the footsteps came to a sudden halt. "Hello?" There was a silence. Harry got to his feet and peered around the tree. It was too dark to see very far, but he could sense somebody standing just beyond the range of his vision. "Who's there?" he said. And then, without warning, the silence was rent by a voice unlike any they had heard in the wood, and it uttered, not a panicked shout, but what sounded like a spell. "Mos Mordre!" And something vast, green, and glittering erupted from the patch of darkness Harry's eyes had been struggling to penetrate. It flew up over the treetops and into the sky. "What the—" gasped Ron as he sprang to his feet again, staring up at the thing that had appeared. For a split second, Harry thought it was another leprechaun formation. Then he realized that it was a colossal skull, comprised of what looked like emerald stars, with a serpent protruding from its mouth like a tongue. As they watched, it rose higher and higher, blazing in a haze of greenish smoke, etched against the black sky like a new constellation. Suddenly, the wood all around them erupted with screams. Harry didn't understand why, but the only possible cause was the sudden appearance of the skull, which had now risen high enough to illuminate the entire wood like some grisly neon sign. He scanned the darkness for the person who had conjured the skull, but he couldn't see anyone. "Who's there?" he called down. "Harry, come on, move!" Hermione had seized the collar of his jacket and was tugging him backward. "What's the matter?" Harry said, startled to see her face so white and terrified. "It's the Dark Mock, Harry," Hermione moaned, pulling him as hard as she could. "You know whose sign?" "Voldemort's? Harry, come on!" Harry turned. Ron was hurriedly scooping up his miniature Crumb. The 3 of them started across the clearing, but before they had taken a few hurried steps, a series of popping noises announced the arrival of 20 wizards, appearing from thin air surrounding them. Harry whirled around, and in an instant he registered one fact. Each of the wizards had his wand out, and every wand was pointing right at himself, Ron, and Hermione. Without pausing to think, he yelled, "Duck!" He seized the other two and pulled them down onto the ground. "Stupefy!" roared 20 voices. There was a blinding series of flashes, and Harry felt the hair on his head ripple as though a powerful wind had swept the clearing. Raising his head a fraction of an inch, he saw jets of fiery red light flying over them from the wizards' wands, crossing one another, bouncing off tree trunks, rebounding into the darkness. "Stop!" yelled a voice he recognized. "Stop! That's my son!" Harry's hair stopped blowing about. He raised his head a little higher. The wizard in front of him lowered his wand. He rolled over and saw Mr. Weasley striding toward them, looking terrified. "Ron, Harry," his voice sounded shaky. "Hermione, are you all right?" "Out of the way, Arthur," said a cold, curt voice. It was Mr. Crouch. He and the other Ministry wizards were closing in on them. Harry got to his feet to face them. Mr. Crouch's face was taut with rage. "Which of you did it?" he snapped, his sharp eyes darting between them. "Which of you conjured the dark mark?" "We didn't do that," said Harry, gesturing up at the skull. "We didn't do anything," said Ron, who was rubbing his elbow and looking indignantly at his father. "What did you want to attack us for?" "Do not lie, sir," shouted Mr. Crouch. His wand was still pointing directly at Ron, and his eyes were popping. He looked slightly mad. "You have been discovered at the scene of the crime." "Barty," whispered a witch in a long woolen dressing gown. "They're kids, Barty. They'd never have been able to—" "Where did the mark come from, you three?" said Mr. Weasley quickly. "Over there," said Hermione shakily, pointing at the place where they had heard the voice. "There was someone behind the trees. They shouted words, an incantation." "Oh, stood over there, did they?" said Mr. Crouch, turning his popping eyes on Hermione now, disbelief etched all over his face. "Said an incantation, did they? You seem very well informed about how that mark is summoned, Missy." But none of the Ministry wizards, apart from Mr. Crouch, seemed to think it remotely likely that Harry, Ron, or Hermione had conjured the skull. On the contrary, at Hermione's words, they had all raised their wands again and were pointing in the direction she had indicated, squinting through the dark trees. "We're too late," said the witch in the woolen dressing gown, shaking her head. "They'll have disapparated." "I don't think so," said a wizard with a scrubby brown beard. "It was Amos Diggory, Cedric's father. Our stunners went right through those trees. There's a good chance we got them." Amos, be careful, said a few of the wizards warningly, as Mr. Diggory squared his shoulders, raised his wand, marched across the clearing, and disappeared into the darkness. Hermione watched him vanish with her hands over her mouth. A few seconds later, they heard Mr. Diggory shout, "Yes, we got them. There's someone here, unconscious. But, blimey." "You've got someone," shouted Mr. Crouch, sounding highly disbelieving. "Who? Who is it?" They heard snapping twigs, the rustling of leaves, and then crunching footsteps as Mr. Diggory reemerged from behind the trees. He was carrying a tiny, limp figure in his arms. Harry recognized the tea towel at once. It was Winky. Mr. Crouch did not move or speak as Mr. Diggory deposited his elf on the ground at his feet. The other Ministry wizards were all staring at Mr. Crouch. For a few seconds, Crouch remained transfixed, his eyes blazing in his white face as he stared down at Winky. Then he appeared to come to life again. "This cannot be," he said jerkily. "No." He moved quickly around Mr. Diggory and strode off toward the place where he had found Winky. "No point, Mr. Crouch," Mr. Diggory called after him. "There's no one else there." But Mr. Crouch did not seem prepared to take his word for it. They could hear him moving around and rustling of leaves as he pushed the bushes aside, searching. "Bit embarrassing," Mr. Diggory said grimly, looking down at Winky's unconscious form. "Barty Crouch's house elf, I mean to say." "Come off it, Amos," said Mr. Weasley quietly. "You don't seriously think it was the elf? The dark mark's a wizard's sign. It requires a wand." "Yeah," said Mr. Diggory, "and she had a wand." "What? Here, look." Mr. Diggory held up a wand and showed it to Mr. Weasley. "Had it in her hand. So that's Clause 3 of the Code of Wand Use broken, for a start. No non-human creature is permitted to carry or use a wand." Just then there was another pop, and Ludo Bagman apparated right next to Mr. Weasley. Looking breathless and disoriented, he spun on the spot, goggling upward at the emerald green skull. "The dark mark," he panted, almost trampling Winky as he turned inquiringly to his colleagues. "Who did it? Did you get them? Barty, what's going on?" Mr. Crouch had returned empty-handed. His face was still ghostly white, and his hands and his toothbrush mustache were both twitching. "Where have you been, Barty?" said Bagman. "Why weren't you at the match? Your elf was saving you a seat, too. Gulping gargoyles." Bagman had just noticed Winky lying at his feet. "What happened to her?" "I've been busy, Ludo," said Mr. Crouch, still talking in the same jerky fashion, barely moving his lips. "And my elf has been stunned." "Stunned? By you lot, you mean? But why?" Comprehension dawned suddenly on Bagman's round, shiny face. He looked up at the skull, down at Winky, and then at Mr. Crouch. "No," he said. "Winky? Conjure the dark mark? She wouldn't know how. She'd need a wand for a start." "And she had one," said Mr. Diggory. "I found her holding one, Ludo. If all's right with you, Mr. Crouch, I think we should hear what she's got to say for herself." Crouch gave no sign that he had heard Mr. Diggory, but Mr. Diggory seemed to take his silence for assent. He raised his own wand, pointed it at Winky, and said, "Renervate. Renervate." Winky stirred feebly. Her great brown eyes opened, and she blinked several times in a bemused sort of way. Watched by the silent wizards, she raised herself shakily into a sitting position. She caught sight of Mr. Diggory's feet, and slowly, tremulously, raised her eyes to stare up into his face. Then, more slowly still, she looked up into the sky. Harry could see the floating skull reflected twice in her enormous, glassy eyes. She gave a gasp, looked wildly around the crowd clearing, and burst into terrified sobs. "Elf," said Mr. Diggory sternly, "do you know who I am? I'm a member of the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures." Winky began to rock backward and forward on the ground, her breath coming up in short bursts. Harry was reminded forcibly of Dobby in these moments of terrified disobedience. "As you see, Elf, the dark mark was conjured here a short while ago," said Mr. Diggory, "and you were discovered moments later right beneath it. An explanation, if you please." I is not doing it, sir," Winky gasped. "I is not knowing how, sir." "You were found with a wand in your hand," barked Mr. Diggory, brandishing it in front of her, and as the wand caught the green light that was filling the clearing from the skull above, Harry recognized it. "Hey, that's mine." Everyone in the clearing looked at him. "Excuse me?" said Mr. Diggory incredulously. "That's my wand. I dropped it." "You dropped it?" repeated Mr. Diggory in disbelief. "Is this a confession? You threw it aside after you conjured the mark?" "Amos, think who you're talking to," said Mr. Weasley, very angrily. "Is Harry Potter likely to conjure the dark mark?" Of course not," mumbled Mr. Diggory. "Sorry, carried away." I mean, it kind of makes sense, actually, if he wanted to get Voldemort there and then just beat him up. Hey guys, so we're going to ASMR Tyler's pee. I told him about that, and he was just like, you know what we need? We need, for our new place, we need a light that says live. Can you guys hear that? Yeah, an on-air sign, so they know, so he knows. Okay. Okay, let's do this. Okay, I didn't drop it there anyway, said Harry, jerking his thumb toward the trees beneath the skull. I missed it right after we got into the wood. So, said Mr. Diggory, his eyes hardening as he turned to look at Winky again, cowering at his feet. You found this wand, Elf? And you picked it up and thought you'd have some fun with it, did you? I is not doing magic with it, sir, squealed Winky, tears streaming down the sides of her squashed and bulbous nose. I is just picking it up, sir. I is not making the dark mark, sir. I is not knowing how. It wasn't her. Sorry. It wasn't her, said Hermione. She looked very nervous, speaking up in front of all these ministry wizards, yet determined all the same. Winky's got a squeaky little voice, and the voice we heard during the incantation was much deeper. She looked around at Harry and Ron, appealing for their support. It didn't sound anything like Winky, did it? No, said Harry, shaking his head. It definitely didn't sound like an elf. Yeah, it was a human voice. Well, we'll soon see, growled Mr. Diggory, looking unimpressed. There's a simple way of discovering the last spell a wand performed, Elf. Did you know that? Winky trembled and shook her head frantically, her ears flapping, as Mr. Diggory raised his own wand again and placed it tip to tip with Harry's. Prior incantado. Night, Cassie. Dom, what are you saying in my... Love. Ugh. Harry heard Hermione gasp, horrified, as a gigantic serpent-tongued skull erupted from the point where the two wands met. But it was a mere shadow of the green skull high above them. It looked as though it were made of thick grey smoke, the ghost of a spell. Deletrius, Mr. Diggory shouted, and the smoky skull vanished in a wisp of smoke. So, said Mr. Diggory with a kind of savage triumph, looking down upon Winky, who was still shaking convulsively. I is not doing it, she squealed, her eyes rolling in terror. I is not know how. I is a good elf. I isn't using wands. I isn't knowing how. You've been caught red-handed, Elf, Mr. Diggory roared, caught with the guilty wand in your hand. Amos, said Mr. Weasley loudly, think about it. Precious few wizards know how to do that spell. Where would she have learned it? Perhaps Amos is suggesting, said Mr. Crouch, cold anger in every syllable, that I routinely teach my servants to conjure the dark mark. There was deeply unpleasant silence. Amos Diggory looked horrified. Mr. Crouch, not at all. You have now come very close to accusing the two people in this clearing who are least likely to conjure that mark, barked Mr. Crouch. Harry Potter and myself. I suppose you are familiar with the boy's story, Amos? Of course, everyone knows, muttered Mr. Diggory, looking highly discomforted. And I trust you remember the many proofs I have given over a long career that I despise and detest the dark arts and those who practice them. Mr. Crouch shouted, his eyes bulging again. Mr. Crouch, I never suggested you had anything to do with it, Amos Diggory muttered again, now reddening behind his scrubby brown beard. If you accuse my elf, you accuse me, Diggory, shouted Mr. Crouch. Where else would she have learned to conjure it? She might have picked it up anywhere. Precisely, Amos, said Mr. Weasley. She might have picked it up anywhere. Winky, he said kindly, turning to the elf, but she flinched as though he too was shouting at her. Where exactly did you find Harry's wand? Winky was twisting the hem of her tea towel so violently that it was fraying beneath her fingers. I is finding it there, sir, she whispered. There, in the tree, sir. You see, Amos, said Mr. Weasley, whoever conjured the mark could have disapparated right after they'd done it, leaving Harry's wand behind. A clever thing to do, not using their own wand, which would have betrayed them. And Winky here had the misfortune to come across the wand moments later and pick it up. But then she'd have been only a few feet away from the real culprit, said Mr. Diggory impatiently. Elf, did you see anyone? Winky began to tremble worse than ever. Her giant eyes flickered from Diggory to Ludo Bagman on to Mr. Crouch. Then she gulped and said, I is seeing no one, sir, no one. Amos, said Mr. Crouch curtly, I am fully aware that in the ordinary course of events you would want to take Winky into your department for questioning. I ask you, however, to allow me to deal with her. Mr. Diggory looked as though he didn't think much of this suggestion at all, but it was clear to Harry that Mr. Crouch was such an important member of the ministry that he did not dare refuse him. You may rest assured that she will be punished, Mr. Crouch added coldly. Master, Winky stammered, looking up at Mr. Crouch, her eyes brimming with tears. Master, please. Mr. Crouch stared back, his face somehow sharpened, each line upon it more deeply etched. There was no pity in his gaze. Winky has behaved tonight in a manner I would not have believed possible, he said slowly. I told her to remain in the tent. I told her to stay there while I went to sort out the trouble, and I find that she disobeyed me. This means close. No, shrieked Winky, prostrating herself as Mr. Crouch's feet. No, master, not close, not close. Harry knew that the only way to turn a house elf free was to present it with proper garments. It was pitiful to see the way Winky clutched at her tea towel as she sobbed over Mr. Crouch's feet. But she was frightened, Hermione burst out angrily, glaring at Mr. Crouch. Your elf's scared of heights, and those wizards in masks were levitating people. You can't blame her for wanting to get out of their way. Mr. Crouch took a step backward, freeing himself from contact with the elf, whom he was surveying as though she were something filthy and rotten that was contaminating his overshined shoes. I have no use for a house elf who disobeys me, he said coldly, looking over at Hermione. I have no use for a servant who forgets what it is due to her master and to her master's reputation. Winky was crying so hard that her sobs echoed around the clearing. There was a very nasty silence, which was ended by Mr. Weasley, who said quietly, Well, I think I'll take my lot back to the tent, if nobody's got any objections. Amos, that wand's told us all it can. If Harry could have it back, please. Mr. Diggory handed Harry his wand, and Harry pocketed it. Come on, you three, Mr. Weasley said quietly. But Hermione didn't seem to want to move. Her eyes were still upon the sobbing elf. Hermione, Mr. Weasley said, more urgently. She turned and followed Harry and Ron out of the clearing and off the trees. What's going to happen to Winky? Said Hermione, the moment they had left the clearing. I don't know, said Mr. Weasley. The way they were treating her, said Hermione furiously. Mr. Diggory calling her elf all the time, and Mr. Crouch. He knows she didn't do it. He's still going to sack her. He didn't care how frightened she'd been or how upset she was. It was like she wasn't even human. Well, she's not, said Ron. Hermione rounded on him. That doesn't mean she hasn't got feelings, Ron. It's disgusting the way... Hermione, I agree with you, said Mr. Weasley quickly, beckoning her on. But now is not the time to discuss elf rights. I want to get back to the tent as far as we can. What happened to the others? We lost them in the dark, said Ron. Dad, why was everyone so uptight about that skull thing? I'll explain everything back at the tent, said Mr. Weasley. But when they reached the edge of the wood, their progress was impeded. A large crowd of frightened-looking witches and wizards was congregated there, and when they saw Mr. Weasley coming toward them, many of them surged forward. What's going on in there? Who conjured it? Arthur, it's not him. Of course it's not him, said Mr. Weasley impatiently. We don't know who it was. It looks like they disapparated. Now excuse me, please. I want to get to bed. He led Harry, Ron, and Hermione through the crowd and back into the campsite. All was quiet now. There was no sign of the masked wizards, though several ruined tents were still smoking. Charlie's head was poking out of one of the boys' tents. Dad, what's going on? He called through the dark. Fred, George, and Ginny got back okay, but the others... I've got them here, said Mr. Weasley, bending down and entering the tent. The tent? Okay, Harry, Ron, and Hermione entered after him. Bill was sitting at the small kitchen table, holding a bedsheet to his arm, which was bleeding profusely. Charlie had a large rip in his shirt, and Percy was sporting a bloody nose. Fred, George and Ginny looked unhurt, though shaken. "Did you get them, Dad?" said Bill sharply. "The person who conjured the mark?" "No," said Mr. Weasley. "We found Barty Crouch's elf holding Harry's wand, but we're none the wiser who actually conjured the mark." "What?" said Bill, Charlie, and Percy together. "Harry's wand," said Fred. "Mr. Crouch's elf," said Percy, sounding thunderstruck. With some assistance from Harry, Ron, and Hermione, Mr. Weasley explained what had happened in the woods. When they had finished their story, Percy swelled indignantly. "Well, Mr. Crouch is quite right to get rid of an elf like that," he said, running away when he'd expressly told her not to, embarrassing him in front of the whole ministry. How would that have looked if she'd been brought up in front of the Department for Regulation and Control? "She didn't do anything. She was just in the wrong place at the wrong time." Hermione snapped at Percy, who looked very taken aback. Hermione had always gotten on fairly well with Percy, better, indeed, than any of the others. "Hermione, a wizard in Mr. Crouch's position can't afford a house elf who's going to run amok with a wand," said Percy pompously, recovering himself. "She didn't run amok," shouted Hermione. "She just picked it off the ground." "Look, can someone just explain what that skull thing was?" said Ron impatiently. "It wasn't hurting anyone. Why is it such a big deal?" I told you, it's you-know-who's symbol, Ron," said Hermione, before anyone else could answer. "I read about it in The Rise and Fall of the Dark Arts. And it hasn't been seen for 13 years, said Mr. Weasley, quietly. Of course, people panicked, and it was almost like seeing you-know-who back again. "I don't get it," said Ron, frowning. "I mean, it's still only a shape in the sky." "Ron, you-know-who and his followers sent the dark mark into the air whenever they killed," said Mr. Weasley. "The terror it inspired. You have no idea. You're too young. Just picture coming home and finding the dark mark hovering over your house, and knowing what you're about to find inside." Mr. Weasley winced. "Everyone's worst fear. The very worst." There was silence for a moment. Then Bill, removing the sheet from his arm to check on his cut, said, "Well, it didn't help us tonight, whoever conjured it. It scared the Death Eaters away the moment they saw it. They all disapparated before we'd got near enough to unmask any of them. We caught the Robertses before they hit the ground, though. They're having their memories modified right now." "Death Eaters," said Harry. "What are Death Eaters?" "It's what you-know-who's supporters called themselves," said Bill. "I think we saw that what's left of them tonight, the ones who managed to keep themselves out of Azkaban anyway." "We can't prove it was them, Bill," said Mr. Weasley. "Though it probably was," he added hopelessly. "Yeah, I bet it was," said Ron suddenly. "Dad, we met Draco Malfoy in the woods, and he as good as told us his dad was one of those nutters in masks, and we all know the Malfoys were right in with you-know-who." "But what were Voldemort's supporters?" Harry began. Everybody flinched. Like most of the wizarding world, the Weasleys always avoided saying Voldemort's name. "Sorry," said Harry quickly. "What were you-know-who's supporters up to? Levitating muggles? I mean, what was the point?" "The point," said Mr. Weasley with a hollow laugh. "Harry, that's their idea of fun. Half the muggle killings back when you-know-who was in power were done for fun. I suppose they had a few drinks tonight and couldn't resist reminding us all that lots of them are still at large. A nice little reunion for them," he finished disgustedly. "But if they were Death Eaters, why did they disapparate when they saw the dark mark?" said Ron. "They'd have been pleased to see it, wouldn't they?" "Use your brains, Ron," said Bill. "If they were really Death Eaters, they worked very hard to keep out of Azkaban when you-know-who lost power, and told all sorts of lies about him forcing them to kill and torture people. I bet they'd be even more frightened than the rest of us to see him come back. They denied they'd ever been involved with him when he lost his powers, and went back to their daily lives. I don't reckon he'd be over-pleased with them, do you?" "So, whoever conjured the dark mark," said Hermione slowly. "So, whoever conjured the dark mark," said Hermione slowly. "Were they doing it to show support for the Death Eaters, or to scare them away?" "Your guess is as good as ours, Hermione," said Mr. Weasley. "To scare them away. But I'll tell you this. It was only the Death Eaters who ever knew how to conjure it. I'd be very surprised if the person who did it hadn't been a Death Eater once, even if they're not now. Listen, it's very late, and if your mother hears what's happened, she'll be worried sick. We'll get a few more hours sleep and then try and get an early portkey out of here." Harry got back into his bunk with his head buzzing. He knew he ought to feel exhausted, It was nearly 3 in the morning, but he felt wide awake and worried. 3 days ago, it felt like much longer, but it had only been 3 days. He had awoken with his scar burning, and tonight, for the first time in 13 years, Lord Voldemort's mark had appeared in the sky. What did these things mean? He thought of the letter he had written to Sirius before leaving Privet Drive. Would Sirius have gotten it yet? When would he reply? Harry lay looking up at the canvas, but no flying fantasies came to him now to ease him to sleep, and it was a long time after Charlie's snores filled the tent that Harry finally dozed off. Why are you guys saying Moldywort? Oh, Voldemort. Moldymort. And that was the end of chapter 9. I think I'm gonna start. So I'm gonna talk to you guys and talk to people on Twitch tomorrow. I've kind of hit a point again where like it's a oscillating thing that's this way. I don't know what this. It's a roller coaster. Sometimes I very much prefer making videos. Sometimes I very much prefer streaming. Lately, I think just with my mental health and everything that's been happening and the stress, I've been getting just really anxious when I come on stream, especially because we don't have a game that's like keeping me preoccupied, and I'm just looking at numbers and I just feel like I'm not entertaining and I'm not fun, and then I get tired really easily. So I'm gonna start paying more attention to videos and Patreon and Discord and hanging out with you guys rather than like forcing 5-hour streams, you know, or like beating myself up if I couldn't do 3 or 4, you know. So if we like just bring it down to like we think of Twitch as like a part-time job, and I just have multiple part-time jobs. Where I think seeing Tyler stream so much because it's his only job. Well, no, he answers Discord messages and he's really good with DMs and stuff. So, I mean, he does a lot. I'm not saying that he just streams, but I was feeling bad about me not streaming so long when I see him streaming like 8-9 hours, you know. But I don't know. I talked to him about it. I kind of broke it down, and I don't know. Yeah, I think I've been burning myself out on all 3. And guys, I get to show you. So our new place, we're just renting, obviously. But the basement downstairs. So we realized, so it's the more expensive one. We realized we're not going to have any friends at this new place, and because we're moving away again. And so Randy wants to move close. And we realized today when we signed the lease and we went in, this house is humongous. Like, it's a good price. For what it is, it's a really good price. And I just realized, like, maybe we could get Randy to move in with us so we can all save some money, because it's a really nice house. But this whole basement, it's all unfinished, but it's huge, and I'll be just able to have this whole area downstairs. And if I can do this right, I can film during the day. I can film anytime. So not only will I be in not a house built in like the 1910s, I'll have a huge, no, he has a room upstairs, a huge basement, but for most people it's wasted space because it's unfinished. But for me, I'm like, guys, like I'll maybe I can post it to you guys on Discord. Hold on. Even just like show you, like, so there's like this would have been like 2 small rooms, and then, or like a bathroom, a room, and then like a big like bonus room or something for a family. Yeah. So the thing is, we're renting. what ideal is, I can save up, and then in the next couple years, if we move to Florida, we can get there quicker. But over the next, whatever, 3 or 4 years, if we just save really hard, and this will help if Randy moves in with us, we can get a little house with a unfinished basement and then create a sound studio that would just like allow me, because even if I don't see myself doing ASMR or streaming as a career for the rest of my life, to be able to do it even as a hobby, or like have a place down where I can just like, just have my own space. And we did a stress test today where I was down in the basement and Tyler was upstairs on the second floor, where in his stream room, like screaming as loud as he could. And like you could hear him, but it was very slight. My microphones would be able to pick it up, but there's also nothing in the house, so it's all very echoey. It's big, and so hopefully we can try to figure out something. Yeah, a freestanding booth. Yeah, because there's just so much space, So yeah, I guess that's true, Snuffles. But yeah. So I can't wait for you guys to see this. It's so big. Unfortunately, I forgot that it takes time for internet people to go out there. So they're not coming until Friday. But at least on Friday, you guys can see it. I'll stream it and you guys can see just how much space I have down there. The only thing is, it's all concrete and like insulated stuff, and there's like a big thing in the middle that kind of has this hum, so I might have to spend some money on some like I already started doing some research on like getting like industrial blankets to go over it so you can't hear the hum, but even just like building just like 4 walls or freestanding things for a booth would be great. So I will show you guys. Yeah. Oh, I was thinking the exact same thing, Dima. Like it's honestly the basement in and of itself, like this is insane to think of like where I've come from when I started streaming when I was 21. 20. Being in this rinky-dink, it's still my favorite place though, don't get me wrong, like this studio apartment with 1 bedroom, the kitchen being as big as the bathroom, like, to now this basement is as big as, like, way bigger than that studio. And then if we get Randy, I'll be paying like the same amount of that studio. So I'm just really excited. I've been really happy the past weekend, just like, we finally got a place. And it's just for the next year to know, or back when your first 3DO tripod was a cardboard box. I know. Hey, we still, this Yeti is chilling on a book, so a tiny upgrade. I would love to talk about it. Yes, you and Snuffles, anybody else. I'll send you guys. Tomorrow I will go over and maybe I can even just do a stream from my phone and show everybody. This is a big book that I got sent that I'm supposed to read for a video, actually. No, but yeah, I'll show you guys. I'll do the tape measurements, and I mean, even like I could bring my filming equipment over there and I can just take the day and film. Like, do you know how insane that would be to just be alone in a place and just film and it be quiet? Like, can you guys think? Can you think? Like, I can explore different concepts. I can move around. I'm really excited. A quiet place. So yeah, dungeon. No, but really, guys, really, I'm super stoked. I mean, I was even like, I kind of wanted to talk to, what am I doing? Well, I guess I don't know, because there's little spaces where I could like literally turn it into, I could just hire somebody, an insulation guy, to come in and just soundproof it normally in just a small little area. Um, but I mean, to me, it's like if a tenant, like a renter, wanted to do that to my house that I was renting, I'd be like, yeah, go for it. Like, that only ups the value. I don't know. I think literally anybody could appreciate a soundproof room. Whether you have a baby or you need a place to just go read books, you want to record music, you want to do podcasts, you want to listen to music loud, you want to dance, like whatever it is, I feel like we can build temporary walls that can be taken apart. Soundproof that would be better so you can take it anywhere you go. Okay. Shove the Bubba in the soundproof room. But really, though, that's what I'm saying. I mean, because Tyler was like, but who uses a soundproof room? I was like, I could think of so many ways. Like even ASMR artists, musicians, serial killers. No, but I was thinking like, Sam, my brother and his kid, they have to use this white noise machine because I don't know, he doesn't like to hear anything, so put the baby in the room so it doesn't disturb TV time. But yeah, I will show you guys that tomorrow. I'm excited for it. It's going to be a lot of work, and honestly, it's like a proper house that like I could see my parents getting. So it's weird, like, but I finagled. We saved $100 on it because I was like, we will think about renting if you were to take $200 off, and they were like 100. I was like, okay. And yeah, it's you've hit the big leagues. Yeah, I know. Go me. Feel like a soccer mom. So yeah, we're still working it out. We'll see. Randy will be coming next week. He was gonna look for places around us, but also he's gonna check out the new place. So that title is ruined. The art of negotiation. Yeah, I know. They might have come back with 250. No, I did not. There's no way they would have. Do you accept bits? Oh my goodness. But yeah, so I will keep you guys updated. I ran some errands, got some boxes, got tape, so we can start slowly. So we have like my lease doesn't end for a month. So that's why we did this very slowly, because it's not like it's just down the road of a move, but we can take our time with it, and we're not stressed. But there's the thing, we tried to get our money back for the cruise. I feel like I'm talking really loud. I'm sorry. I don't have my headphones in. But we couldn't. So we have to go on the cruise. And then, so that's July 12th, that weekend for his birthday. And then that's so like us, where I'm like, hey, I'll book this for your birthday. And we're like super stoked for it. And then we're like, no. Yeah, I know. I was like, maybe we should give them to somebody. Yeah, I know. It sounds awful, like have to go, but it's just, we didn't think about the timing, really. Just like moving. We have this family weekend thing. It's just, we'll see. Good night, Dima. Okay, cool. Thank you, Snuffles. All right, guys. So yeah, I think we will save this for tomorrow. At least that'll be fun for stream. We'll do something silly for stream. I wanted to start doing creative streams as well, and like make little clay figurines. I used to do that all the way back before I left to Australia. Those were fun times. But yeah, I love you guys. Thank you for being here. This book has gotten really fun. We will figure out, Quiggles, please. We will figure out We'll start doing 2 book clubs a week. We'll have a Patreon live stream a week where we can just chat, think of new suggestions, triggers. Yeah, slowly move. I'll let you guys know. Yes, we have sub streams on Twitch. That's why I keep forgetting. We'll utilize those this week too. So, I love you guys. I hope you have a good night. Thanks for staying up with me. Sorry that we didn't do it last night. Tyler said that he really wanted to hear these chapters, but we got a little caught on his stream, and I was like, oh, it's already like 11. It's almost midnight, you know. So I love you guys. Have a good night. I will see you tomorrow.